The iceberg is questionable. What sank the legendary superliner Titanic in 1912? Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most famous tragedies of the last century. We'll talk about the Titanic and what really killed the ship. Why there were no binoculars on board. Is it true that before the liner sailed, its hull suffered from fire? And what was told by the passenger Vaginac Biurat, who not only survived that fateful night, but also named the true cause of the ship's destruction? Be sure to watch the video to the very end so that you don't miss anything important. Common mistakes. So, many of you know that the legendary liner Titanic went on its first and last voyage in 1912. The itinerary from the English city of Southampton to New York across the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, the largest steamship of that time collided with an iceberg and went down. This is the well-known version for today. But is everything so unambiguous? It turns out that it is not. Let's start with the fact that in the process of Titanic's operation, many mistakes were made. The hull of the ship was built of metal and rivets were made of iron. The latter simply could not withstand the load of the collision with the iceberg. But in case if this element of construction was made of steel, then perhaps the hull could withstand the impact. The next thing to pay attention to is the absence of binoculars on board the liner, although there is now speculation about the items being in a special room. After the Titanic set sail, the key to that very room was banally forgotten to give to the captain. Now you realize that the iceberg could have been noticed in time. Alas, but the lack of an important item for the ship's captain and crew members led to tragic consequences. The lifeboats on the Titanic also played a cruel joke on the passengers. The capacity of the lifeboats at the time was supposed to be 60 people. However, it is known that the capacity was reduced by 3 times. On the night from April 14th to April 15th, the dinghies were half filled due to insufficient preparation of passengers. Tell me honestly, did you know that Captain Edward John Smith failed his navigation exam? It was only on the second attempt that he managed to pass it. It is possible that the captain, because of his lack of experience, is indirectly responsible for the tragedy of the ship and more than 1,500 people. And here we came to the most important thing. The departure of the Titanic on April 12, 1912. Few who knows, but the first signal that gave the alarm bell was an unbroken bottle of champagne. And as you can imagine, over the long decades, the tradition of breaking a bottle has become firmly entrenched in many countries around the world. In Titanic's case, the bottle didn't break the first time. In addition, the Titanic was traveling faster than the speed that the rules originally dictated. That's why the possibility of a collision was inevitable. The liner physically could not stop in time or go around its enemy after late detection of the iceberg. And the last thing they try not to talk about is the fact of fire in the lower part of the Titanic's hull. It is quite likely that the fire occurred in the boiler room. And yes, everyone who was responsible for the construction and launching of the liner knew about it. But they decided that such a defect would not affect the Titanic itself. But the flames damaged the metal and weakened its main property, strength. And here we can say with certainty that the hull would have withstood the load of the collision, if it weren't for the damaged part of the liner. For your understanding, Shannon Maloney, a journalist by profession, was one of the first to discover a darkened spot in the lower part of the hull. It appears to have been caused by a fire. Many of you will ask, could the trip have been postponed and therefore all the defects fixed? Theoretically, yes, because many people realized that the Titanic was slightly damaged. But there's one thing. All tickets were sold out, and the attempt to prolong the stop of the liner at the pier threatened to bankrupt the management staff of the company, White Star Line. Besides, everyone was initially preparing for such a grandiose event as the launching of the giant into the water. Luxury for first-class passengers. You probably know that the distribution of passengers was according to the class to which they belonged. Of course, the first-class passengers had more privileges. Luxury in full was given to them even on the ship. First of all, 13 different dishes and expensive alcohol. This is clearly demonstrated in the movie Titanic, directed by James Cameron. Everyone who watched it remembers the scene of the fancy first-class meals. Plus, during the meals, the passengers had entire social gatherings and discussed many topics of conversation. In terms of time, this amounted to up to 5 hours each day. Secondly, first-class passengers had swimming pools, gyms and pet dressing rooms at their disposal. All of them were made according to the highest quality and comfort. As they say, no one denied himself anything. Titanic's engineers provided a unique interior inside the ship. Suffice it to cite the example of the long corridors. If they are presented as a whole, the length of such a corridor will be several kilometers. And Titanic was also decorated with an elegant staircase, accompanied by paintings, statuettes, and other luxury items. It is shown in the movie. So, in general terms, you can imagine the interior of that historical period. Was there a clash or not? Here we come to the question that torments most of our contemporaries, whether the Titanic collided with that ill-fated iceberg or not. For this, we just have to tell about one of the surviving passengers of the liner. He explained about one key detail. The name of the ship's passenger is Vaganak Burat. The man was able to convey the information that a few hours before the wreck there were several explosions on the Titanic. After them, there was a fire of the liner. These processes occurred not on the deck itself, but in the lower part of the hull. It is assumed that on the night from April 14th to April 15th, there was an explosion in the boiler room of the liner. To date, to explain what exactly happened then, almost unrealistic. According to Burat, flames began to spread quickly enough on the Titanic. After the explosion, the ship had to be de-energized. Then panic gripped almost all the passengers. These news cannot yet be confirmed, as additional checks are needed. But it is not advisable to rule them out either. The fact that the Titanic initially suffered from a fire says a lot. As for the original version, the collision with the iceberg is confirmed by important circumstances. We talked about them at the very beginning. Nevertheless, let's make sure once again that everything did not go according to the plan. Lack or limited access to binoculars, insufficient number of lifeboats, inexperience of the captain in navigation, fire in the hull, excessive speed of the superliner. The last thing we draw your attention to is the actions of the passengers and crew members of the ship at the time of the tragic events. Here clearly everyone was in a hurry and did not fill the lifeboats completely. Initially, the lifeboats were launched with only half filled. SOS signals were also sent, but they had to wait for help for more than 2 hours. During this time, the Titanic sank to the bottom of the Atlantic, but the flares were still launched that night. By the way, there really was a ship Californian, but its crew did not help the victims. Why did this happen? According to one version of the crew members of the Californian did not notice the signals because of the scattering and invisibility of signal lights. According to another version, the Titanic considered for the ship poachers and therefore decided not to contact the alleged violators and left as soon as possible. Conclusion. Thus, the tragedy of the Titanic is not only the most famous, but also mysterious at the moment. We will have to deal with the question thoroughly to restore the entire chronology of those events. Perhaps the true cause is not the one that was originally announced.